This will be the last cup I ever serve you. Ethan Caldwell didn't notice the words until the elevator doors had already closed behind him. By then, the paper sleeve was warm in his hand, the black Americano exactly the way it had been every weekday for the past 4 years. 2 shots, no sugar, lid pressed down tight, because he hated spills in custom Italian suits. Outside, Manhattan moved in its usual rhythm, yellow cabs slicing through wet streets, steam rising from the grates, the gray morning wrapped in a cold March drizzle. Inside the glass tower on Madison Avenue, everything gleamed. Marble floors, brass fixtures, silence polished to look expensive. Ethan crossed the lobby without slowing, phone already to his ear, mind 3 steps ahead of everyone around him. Push the 10 a.m. with Mercer to 11, he said, not looking up. And tell legal I want the seller's final number before noon. If they own air rights, they'll sell. Everyone does. He stepped into the private elevator reserved for tenants on the executive floors, the doors sliding shut on the cafe downstairs, and the woman behind the counter he had somehow trained himself not to really see. Clara Whitmore. Blonde hair pinned back neatly. White blouse under a dark apron. Calm hands. Quiet eyes. Every morning, she had his coffee ready before he spoke. Every morning, she set it down with the same soft, unhurried grace, as if time bent around her instead of the other way around. Ethan knew the exact weight of the cup in his palm. He knew the subtle difference between the days she used the dark roast and the days she switched to the small batch beans she kept hidden under the counter because she'd once overheard him telling a client the regular blend tasted burnt after bad sleep. He knew that on the mornings he walked in with his jaw set too tight, she would slide a second cup of ice water beside the coffee without charging him. He knew all of that. But if someone had asked him her last name, he wouldn't have had one. If someone had asked him where she lived, what she wanted, or why she carried herself with the kind of quiet certainty that made even impatient bankers lower their voices around her, he would have had nothing. To Ethan, she had become what powerful men too often let people become, part of the architecture. Useful, reliable, invisible. The elevator chimed at the 22nd floor, and the day hit him all at once. Assistants moving too fast. Screens glowing with market opens. A conference room already filling with attorneys in charcoal suits. Through the wall of windows, the city looked like a machine built for people who never stopped. Ethan set the coffee down at the head of the long walnut table and finally noticed the handwriting on the sleeve. Clean. Deliberate. Dark blue ink. This will be the last one I ever serve you. He stared at it for half a second, annoyed more than intrigued. Some kind of joke? A mistake? Maybe the new cafe manager trying to be clever. He almost tossed the sleeve in the trash. But something about the sentence stayed with him. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just final. Like a door closing softly. Mr. Caldwell, his attorney asked. The owner's representative has confirmed. We should have the transfer documents by 10:15. Ethan looked up, the familiar confidence settling back over him like a tailored coat. He gave a short nod and reached for the cup again. Down below, in the lobby cafe he had passed through for years without really seeing, Clara Whitmore untied her apron, folded it once, and placed it on the counter as the building's security director stepped through the front doors and said, in a voice suddenly careful enough to make the entire room go still, "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore. The board is waiting upstairs." For one suspended second, Ethan Caldwell forgot to breathe. Not because the words were dramatic, but because every person in the lobby had suddenly changed the way they stood around Clara Whitmore. It was subtle. A receptionist straightened. The new cafe manager, Brandon Pike, lowered his voice so fast it was almost embarrassing. Even the security director, a man Ethan had seen brush past senators and hedge fund founders without blinking, had stepped aside as if the center of gravity in the building had quietly shifted. Upstairs, the boardroom air turned sharp with anticipation. Ethan sat at the head of the walnut table, fingers resting on the coffee cup that now felt strangely heavier than it had 10 minutes ago. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain traced silver lines down the glass, blurring the skyline into something softer than Manhattan usually allowed. "Where is the owner's representative?" he asked, his tone even, though impatience threaded beneath it. He had a full schedule, a pending acquisition, and no patience for theatrical delays. Across from him, Martin Reeves from legal adjusted his tie and checked his watch. "She is on her way up now." "She?" Ethan barely registered the word at first. His mind was still on numbers. Square footage, lease structures, historic preservation clauses, air rights. The building at 410 Madison was the missing piece in a portfolio he had spent 2 years assembling. With the right renovations, the right retail replacements, and the right luxury repositioning, the value could jump by tens of millions. The cafe on the ground floor would be the first thing to go. Too quaint, too personal, too full of regulars who sat too long over $5 drinks. Ethan had already told his design team to imagine polished stone, minimalist lighting, and a branded coffee concept that looked expensive enough to photograph well. He had said it so casually the week before that he barely remembered the exact words. Strip out the nostalgia. Keep the traffic. At the time, Clara had been 6 feet away, wiping down the pastry case. She had not reacted. Or maybe she had, and he had simply not noticed. The boardroom doors opened. No one announced her. They did not need to. Clara Whitmore stepped inside, and for the first time in 4 years, Ethan saw her in complete focus. No apron, no order pad, no paper cups warming her hands. She wore a cream wool coat over a slate blue dress cut with clean, quiet elegance. At her wrist sat a slim gold watch, old enough to be inherited, not bought. Her blonde hair was still pinned back, but now it caught the soft light from the windows and made her look less like someone entering a meeting than someone returning to a room that had been waiting for her all along. Behind her came 2 attorneys, the building controller and the chairman of the management board. Every single one of them stood until she reached the end of the table. Martin rose so quickly his chair nearly rolled backward. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, with a respect so instinctive it made Ethan's stomach tighten. "We have the transfer packet ready for your review." Ethan did not move. He looked from Martin to Clara, then to the documents laid neatly in front of the empty seat across from him. Owner, representative, seller. The words rearranged themselves too slowly in his mind, like pieces from a puzzle he should have solved years ago. Clara set a leather folder on the table and met his gaze without flinching. Her expression was calm, unreadable, almost gentle, not triumphant, not cold. That somehow made it worse. Ethan felt the heat of shame rise beneath his collar, sharp and unfamiliar. "Clara," he said before he could stop himself, the name sounding strange in a room that had never belonged to him as much as he had assumed. One of the attorneys slid the top document toward her. "If you are ready, Ms. Whitmore, we can begin." Clara placed one hand on the file, then looked at Ethan with the same quiet steadiness she had used every morning when she handed him coffee. "Actually," she said softly, "before we begin, there is one change to the terms." The room did not move, but everything in it changed. Ethan Caldwell had negotiated billion-dollar deals in rooms colder than this one, with men harder than this one, and he had never felt the ground shift under him the way it did when Clara Whitmore looked down at the transfer packet and calmly said there was one change to the terms. No one interrupted her. That alone told him more than any title ever could. Rain whispered against the glass. The city beyond the windows looked distant now, almost unreal, as if Manhattan itself had stepped back to watch what happened next. Clara slid the top page aside with elegant precision, not rushing, not dramatizing. "The sale structure remains the same," she said, her voice soft enough that everyone leaned in to hear it. "The upper-floor commercial leases remain under review. Historic preservation language stays intact. The tenant protection clause will be expanded." Martin Reeves blinked. "Expanded." Clara gave a small nod. "No displacement of legacy retail. No forced replacement of staff tied to existing ground floor operations. No conversion of the cafe." Silence. Sharp. Immediate. Ethan felt every eye in the room flick toward him and then away again. He did not need anyone to explain why. A week ago, in that same building, he had stood by the pastry case and told Brandon Pike that sentiment did not belong in real estate. He had called the cafe inefficient. He had said the words with a hand around a paper cup she had served him. Now those same words came back like a mirror held too close. "Ms. Whitmore," one of the junior attorneys began carefully, "that adjustment reduces the projected repositioning value by a substantial margin." Clara turned her head slightly. She did not argue. She did not defend. "Then your projections were built on the wrong assumption." The attorney looked down immediately. Ethan felt it again, that strange pressure under his ribs, part disbelief, heart something much more uncomfortable. Respect. Not because she was rich, not because she owned the building, but because she was not trying to win the room. She already had it. Clara, he said, and the sound of her first name in that formal room felt almost reckless. She looked at him, finally, fully, as if granting him a moment he had not earned. Ethan straightened in his chair, suddenly aware of how many mornings he had taken from her without ever offering one real question in return. "You are changing the terms because of the cafe?" he asked. It was a stupid question the second it left his mouth. Too narrow. Too late. But it was honest, and perhaps that was all he had. Clara rested her fingertips lightly on the folder in front of her. "No, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Not Ethan. Not the familiar ease of downstairs. Mr. Caldwell." The distance in it was gentle and devastating. "I am changing the terms because of what the cafe reveals." He said nothing. She continued, still calm, still maddeningly composed. "Anyone can renovate marble. Anyone can install brighter lights, more expensive fixtures, a cleaner logo. That is easy. The harder question is whether a building remains a place people belong to after powerful men are finished improving it." One of the board members shifted, visibly uncomfortable. Ethan did not. He could not, because every word landed exactly where it was meant to. He remembered the mornings now in painful detail. The extra water on hard days. The coffee adjusted without being asked. The way Clara knew when not to speak. The way she always looked directly at people, even when they barely looked back. He had thought he was buying a structure. She had been watching whether he understood what lived inside it. "You have been evaluating me," he said quietly. It was not accusation. It was realization. Clara's expression did not change, but something softer moved behind her eyes, like candlelight seen through glass. "For 4 years," she said. The words settled over the room like snowfall. Ethan exhaled slowly, his pulse suddenly loud in his ears. For years. For years of being known by a woman he had mistaken for background. For years of being handed kindness by someone who had every reason to withhold it. For years of proving, without knowing it, exactly who he was. Clara turned the packet closed and slid it back toward Martin. "There is one more condition," she said. This time, even the rain seemed to stop. "If the deal moves forward, the final decision will not be based on price alone." Her eyes lifted to Ethan's, steady and impossible to hide from. "It will be based on whether you are capable of learning what this building is actually for." Ethan Caldwell had built his entire life on one belief. If you understood value, you controlled the room. But as Clara Whitmore sat across from him with the rain silvering the windows behind her, he realized something deeply unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. He was no longer in control of this one. No one spoke for several long seconds. The boardroom held its breath in the quiet way only expensive rooms could, where even discomfort seemed upholstered. Ethan glanced down at the untouched coffee beside his hand. It had gone lukewarm. He had not taken a sip since she walked in. That, somehow, felt symbolic in a way he did not yet want to examine. "And how exactly?" he said at last, his voice lower now, stripped of the easy certainty he usually wore like a second suit. "Do you propose measuring that?" Clara did not smile. She did not need to. "By what you do next," she said simply. One of the board members, an older man named Harold Fenwick, cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitmore, with respect, this is highly unconventional. We have investors waiting. Deadlines. Signed intent. We cannot convert a transfer process into a philosophy seminar." Ethan almost would have agreed with him any other day. He had said versions of the same thing himself for years. But before he could speak, Clara turned to Harold with the same quiet composure she had used to hand out. "Croissants and receipts downstairs." "Then perhaps," she said, "that is why this building keeps surviving men who only know how to make it look more expensive." Harold fell silent. Ethan watched that happen and felt a strange, unwilling admiration rise again. She never raised her voice. She raised the standard. Clara folded her hands on the table. "My father built 410 Madison in 1987, she said, and now the room leaned in for a different reason. This was no longer a negotiation. It was history being allowed into the room. At the time, everyone told him he was wasting premium square footage by keeping the lobby open, by setting aside below-market leases for small businesses, by designing a cafe where tenants and staff could sit in the same space without feeling like one belonged less than the other. Ethan looked toward the glass wall, but all he saw was his own reflection faintly layered over the skyline. He believed buildings shape behavior, Clara continued. He believed the first 5 minutes of a person's day mattered more than the last 5 figures on a lease agreement. He believed if people entered a place and felt smaller, the building had failed. The words landed harder than she could have known. Or maybe she knew exactly. Ethan remembered every rushed morning he had stormed through that lobby, every clipped instruction into his phone. Every day Clara had placed a cup in front of him with a steadiness he had mistaken for routine instead of intention. The first 5 minutes of his day. He had spent 4 years being cared for by a philosophy he was trying to demolish. You worked in the cafe because of him, Ethan said, more to himself than anyone else. Clara nodded once. After he died, I inherited everything. The board wanted me upstairs. Advisors wanted me invisible. Consultants wanted branding decks and luxury partnerships. But my father did not build a monument. He built a threshold. So I stayed where people revealed themselves. The room went still again, but this time the silence was different. Softer. More human. Ethan felt the truth of it like a hand on his chest. She had not been hiding. She had been witnessing. Then you already know what I am, he said, and the honesty in his own voice surprised him. Clara met his gaze. I know what you have been, she said. Those are not always the same thing. It was not cruel. That was the part that cut deepest. There was no triumph in her face, no satisfaction at his discomfort. Only clarity. Martin Reeves slid the contract back toward Ethan, though the paper suddenly looked less like a deal and more like a test he had not studied for. What do you want from me? Ethan asked, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not mean money. Clara reached into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. No legal stamp, no valuation summary, just a typed list, crisp and simple. She set it in front of him. Tomorrow morning, she said softly, you will spend 1 full day in this building without being treated like Ethan Caldwell. Ethan looked down at the page. Temporary reassignment. Ground floor operations. Tenant support. Cafe service rotation. Maintenance rounds. Leasing desk observation. No executive privileges. No private elevator. No assistants. No special access. His pulse kicked once, hard. Across the table, Clara's voice remained calm as rain. If you want this building, she said, then tomorrow you will learn what it asks of everyone else first. At 6:30 the next morning, Ethan Caldwell stood in front of the employee entrance with a paper badge clipped to his coat and a feeling he could not remember ever having in a business setting. He felt exposed. The rain had passed overnight, leaving Manhattan scrubbed clean and cold, the sidewalks shining under a pale blue sky as delivery trucks rattled down Madison Avenue and steam curled from the street grates like breath. He usually arrived through the private lobby doors with a car waiting and 3 messages already answered before his shoes touched marble. Today, he stood beneath a plain metal awning beside a stack of produce crates and a dented hand truck, while a sleepy line cook held the back door open with one shoulder and gave him a look that landed somewhere between confusion and amusement. You are the suit guy, the cook said. Ethan glanced at the badge. Temp operations trainee. Apparently, he replied. Inside, the building sounded different from the back. Not polished. Not silent. Real. There was the hiss of the espresso machine warming up downstairs, the rumble of freight elevators, the clink of bottles being stocked, the soft squeak of a janitor's cart turning a corner. The hallways smelled like fresh bread, floor cleaner, printer ink, and winter air dragged in on boots. Clara Whitmore was already there. Of course she was. She stood in the cafe behind the counter in her white blouse and dark apron, exactly where he had seen her 1,000 mornings before, as if yesterday's boardroom reveal had been a dream the building itself had invented just to embarrass him. But now that he knew, every detail looked different. Not smaller, sharper, more deliberate. She tied the apron strings behind her back with the same calm precision she had used to revise a multi-million-dollar deal. Then she looked up and met his eyes. You are late, she said softly. Ethan blinked. He checked his watch. 6:32. By 2 minutes. The first tenant comes in at 6:30, Clara said. They always order before speaking. You were meant to notice that. No anger. No lecture. Just fact. Ethan took off his coat without another word and set it over a chair. The cafe looked deceptively simple in the early light. Glass pastry case. Brass shelves. White subway tile. Small round tables polished to a warm shine. But now he noticed what he had missed for years. Every stool was aligned exactly. The sugar jars were filled to the same level. The napkins were folded with geometric precision. A vase of fresh white tulips sat on the corner table, and he would have sworn he had never seen it before, even though the kind of beauty that repeated daily only became invisible to people who expected it. "What do I do?" he asked. Clara slid a tray toward him. Porcelain cups, saucers, stainless steel spoons. Table 6 first. Mrs. Romano likes hot water before her tea. Do not bring lemon unless she asks. She likes having the choice. Ethan frowned. You remember all of that? Clara was already grinding beans. I remember what people reveal when they think no one is paying attention. The front door opened. An older woman in a camel coat stepped inside, cheeks pink from the cold, and smiled the moment she saw Ethan standing behind the counter. Well, she said, delighted. They finally made one of you boys useful. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. Almost. By 7:15, his expensive dress shirt was rolled at the sleeves, his hands smelled like espresso and dish soap, and he had already been corrected 4 times. Once for stacking saucers too loudly. Once for wiping a table in circles instead of straight lines. Once for interrupting a tenant who came down every morning not for coffee, Clara explained, but for 3 minutes of predictable kindness before facing a divorce hearing upstairs. And once for handing a contractor his drink without looking him in the eye. Again, Clara said quietly after the man walked away. Ethan stared at her. It was coffee. No, she said, setting a fresh cup into his hand. It was the first human interaction of his day. The words hit him harder than they should have. Maybe because he had heard the echo before. Maybe because he had spent years measuring buildings by lease terms and finishes, while the woman across from him had been measuring mornings. By 8:05, the lobby was full. He recognized half the faces. Analysts, attorneys, founders, assistants, security, cleaning staff, people he had passed hundreds of times in elevators and hallways. People who all seemed to know Clara by name. She asked about a son's college application, a mother's knee surgery, a bakery order for a birthday upstairs. She remembered who needed decaf, who was fasting, who had an interview, who had cried in the restroom last Thursday and pretended they had allergies. Ethan moved beside her in stunned silence, suddenly aware that he had spent 4 years in this building knowing almost no one at all. Then Clara handed him a small black apron, looked him straight in the eye, and said the words that made his pulse jump all over again. Good. You have survived breakfast. Now we go upstairs, and you are going to meet the tenants you were prepared to erase. The elevator ride to the upper floors felt longer than it ever had before. Ethan Caldwell had spent years stepping into polished silence and emerging into control, but today the mirrored walls reflected a man in a black cafe apron with his sleeves rolled up and a paper badge still clipped crookedly to his shirt. Across from him, Clara Whitmore stood with one hand resting lightly on a leather folder, calm as ever, as if escorting a billionaire through the anatomy of his own blind spots was no more dramatic than refilling cream pitchers. The doors opened on the 7th floor, and Ethan was hit first by sound, not the crisp hush of boardrooms or the muffled confidence of private equity meetings. This floor hummed. Phones rang. Printers clicked. A door buzzed open somewhere down the hall. A receptionist laughed softly while balancing a headset and a legal pad. A young man in a navy blazer jogged past carrying garment bags, nearly colliding with a woman holding a tray of framed photographs. What is this floor? Ethan asked. Clara glanced at him. The tenants you called inefficient. He said nothing. She led him down a corridor lined with brass directory plaques he had never bothered to read. A family-owned immigration law office. A music licensing consultant. A tailoring studio. A nonprofit for veterans transitioning into civilian work. A therapist with a 6-month wait list. A husband and wife accounting firm that had been there, Clara informed him quietly, since 1992. Ethan slowed as they passed each door, and for the first time he saw not square footage but lives compressed into walls. A little brass bell on a suite door where a child's drawing was taped beside office hours. A row of umbrellas drying in a stand outside a therapist's office. A faded Yankees mug on a reception desk worn smooth by 20 years of use. He had studied this building in spreadsheets. Clara had studied it in fingerprints. You want me to meet all of them? He asked. No, Clara said. I want you to understand why they stayed. Their first stop was Suite 714. Romano and daughter custom alterations. The sign was hand-painted. The kind of thing Ethan's branding consultants would have replaced in 12 seconds. Inside, the air smelled faintly of steam, clean cotton, and cedar hangers. Bolts of fabric lined the walls in soft blues, creams, and charcoal. An older woman with silver hair pinned neatly at the back looked up from a sewing table and smiled the moment she saw Clara. "You brought me your investor," she said, as if this had been scheduled all along. Clara nodded once. "Mrs. Romano, this is Ethan Caldwell." Mrs. Romano took off her glasses and studied him for one long, unapologetic second. "You are taller when you are not trying to buy things." Ethan almost laughed, but the truth of it stopped him. Clara left him there for 20 minutes. Not to negotiate, to listen. Mrs. Romano showed him a wedding veil. She had restored for a woman whose mother had worn it in 1978. She showed him a navy dress uniform she was tailoring for a veteran's retirement ceremony upstairs. She pointed to a ledger older than some of Ethan's analysts, each page filled with names, measurements, anniversaries, and notes written in tidy blue ink. "Your spreadsheets call this underperforming retail," she said, not cruelly. "My customers call it the place where they come when life changes shape." The word stayed with him as Clara moved him next door to the therapist's office. Then the nonprofit. Then the tiny music licensing firm where two brothers had built a business from a single borrowed desk after losing their father. Everywhere he went, the same pattern emerged. These people were not in the building because it was glamorous. They were there because it had made room for them before they could afford anywhere else. The rents had been fair. The lease renewals predictable. The lobby cafe a place where nobody had to explain why they looked tired. And always, somehow, Clara knew every story without ever making herself the center of it. By noon, Ethan's expensive shoes hurt. His throat was dry from talking less and hearing more, and the architecture of his ambition had started to crack in places he had not known were fragile. He stood at the window on the 12th floor beside Clara, looking down at the avenue below, yellow cabs sliding past like bright streaks in the sun. "You could have told me," he said quietly. "At any point. You could have said who you were." Clara folded her arms and looked out at the city instead of at him. "I did," she said softly. "Every morning. In every cup. In every person you chose not to see." Ethan swallowed hard, the shame of it settling deeper because she was right. Then Clara turned, handed him a maintenance clipboard, and delivered the next lesson with that same unbearable gentleness. "Good," she said. "Now you are going to spend the afternoon with the people who keep the building alive after everyone important thinks they have gone home." By 3:30, Ethan Caldwell was carrying a maintenance clipboard in one hand and a box of replacement light bulbs in the other, and if anyone had told him 24 hours earlier that this would be the most honest part of his week, he would have laughed them out of the room. The afternoon sun had burned through the morning chill, sending long golden rectangles across the service corridors and freight elevator doors, warming the old brass trim in places tenants never saw, but somehow always felt. The glamorous version of 410 Madison lived in glossy photographs and investor decks. This version lived behind the walls, in utility rooms, in supply closets, in the narrow hallways where air filters hummed and mop buckets rolled, and nobody wore expensive watches because hands were too busy making things work. Clara did not walk beside him now. That was the part he noticed first. After handing him off to Luis Mendoza, the building engineer who had been there for 26 years, she simply said, "Listen more than you speak," and disappeared down the corridor as if she trusted the building itself to finish what she had started. Luis was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, patient, and unimpressed in the way only men with real responsibilities ever were. He wore a navy work shirt with his name stitched above the pocket and moved through the building with the quiet authority of someone who knew every sound it made. "You ever changed a ballast?" Luis asked as they stepped into a maintenance room tucked behind the 12th floor stairwell. Ethan adjusted his grip on the box. "No," Luis nodded, not mocking, just filing the fact away. "Today is full of firsts for you then." The next 3 hours passed in a rhythm Ethan had never respected because he had never truly seen it. He watched Luis troubleshoot a thermostat complaint from a law office without making the receptionist feel foolish. He helped replace flickering bulbs in a hallway outside the therapist's suite because, Luis explained, People come here nervous enough already. Bad lighting makes it worse. He carried folded chairs to a community workshop on the 9th floor hosted by the Veterans Nonprofit. He held open doors, took out flattened cardboard, restocked paper towels in the lobby restrooms. Each task looked small until someone explained who depended on it. A clean restroom for a mother waiting during her son's immigration consultation. Reliable heat for the seamstress steaming bridal fabric. Quiet air vents for the therapist whose clients startled easily. Even the scent in the lobby mattered. Ethan had once approved a proposal for a synthetic signature fragrance in common spaces. Luis laughed when he heard that. This place already has a scent, he said. Coffee in the morning. Old books on the 7th floor. Fresh bread from the cafe ovens. Rain on marble in winter. People remember places by what they feel before they know why. Ethan said nothing, because lately everyone in this building seemed to be speaking a language he should have known years ago. At 5:10, the offices began to empty. Elevators chimed. Heels clicked across stone. Laughter drifted out with coats and laptop bags. The building softened. The people Ethan used to think of as after-hours support emerged into full shape. A janitor named Marisol who knew which executive pretended not to cry in conference rooms after layoffs. A security guard named Ben who kept dog treats in his desk because 3 tenants brought nervous rescue dogs in on Fridays. A male clerk who had memorized every floor because one tenant was going through chemotherapy and sometimes forgot where she had parked her own mind. No one here moved like background. They moved like the pulse under the skin. Ethan was standing in the lobby near the freight elevator when he saw Brandon Pike again. The former cafe manager had returned, red-faced and irritated, speaking sharply to a security guard near the front desk. I left my tablet in the office, Brandon was saying. I need 5 minutes. Ben stayed calm. You can retrieve personal property tomorrow with human resources. Brandon's eyes darted and landed on Ethan. Relief flashed across his face. Mr. Caldwell. Good. Tell him I need access. This is ridiculous. 24 hours ago, Ethan might have solved the inconvenience in 3 words. Today he looked at Ben first. Not Brandon. Ben, who had already worked a 10-hour shift and still stood straight. Ben, who knew every tenant by face and every delivery by instinct. Ben, whose authority Ethan had once treated like furniture. What is the policy? Ethan asked. Ben blinked once, surprised. No re-entry after termination without documented clearance. Ethan nodded slowly. Then the policy stands. Brandon stared at him. You are siding with security? The question hung there, ugly in its assumptions. Ethan looked past him, through the lobby, to the cafe counter where Clara had once again returned to close down the evening register herself. Her hands moved with that same quiet precision. Her head did not lift. She did not need to watch to know what he would choose. No. Ethan said, his voice calm now, steadier than it had been all day. I am finally siding with the people who actually keep the place standing. Brandon left in offended silence. Ben said nothing, but the smallest shift crossed his face. Respect, given without ceremony. Ethan turned toward the cafe, the last of the daylight pooling gold across the marble floor, and found Clara already watching him from behind the counter. She held his gaze for one long second, then gave a barely visible nod. No praise, no smile, just acknowledgement. Somehow, it felt larger than any victory he had ever bought. Then she untied her apron, set it down, and said the words that made the entire long day suddenly feel like it had only been preparation. Come with me, Mr. Caldwell. The building has one more room you have never noticed. Clara Whitmore led Ethan Caldwell past the glowing cafe, past the polished lobby where the last tenants were drifting out into the blue hush of early evening, and toward a narrow brass door near the rear corridor that he would have sworn did not exist. He had crossed this lobby thousands of times. He had stood 10 feet from that wall while checking market reports, arguing over acquisitions, and planning how to redesign a building he had never truly seen. Yet there it was, a small door with a recessed handle, tucked beside a column and half hidden behind a framed black and white photograph of the block from 1988, invisible only to people who never looked long enough. Clara unlocked it with the same silver key he had watched her set on the cafe counter the day before. This was my father's rule, she said as the lock clicked softly. If a room matters, do not make it obvious. Make it discoverable. Inside was a private stairwell, narrow and quiet, lit by warm wall sconces instead of the cold fluorescent strips Ethan expected. The city sounds faded with each step upward. By the time they reached the top landing, all he could hear was their breathing and the distant, softened pulse of traffic below. Clara opened the final door, and Ethan stopped dead in the threshold. The room was not a penthouse office, not a luxury suite, not a hidden executive lounge designed to impress donors and investors. It was a library, small, intimate, beautiful in the kind of way money could not manufacture quickly. Floor-to-ceiling oak shelves lined the walls, filled with worn hardcovers, architectural journals, tenant photo albums, old lease ledgers, framed sketches, and boxes labeled in neat handwriting. A long table sat in the center beneath two shaded lamps, its surface marked by decades of use. Along the far wall, tall windows looked out over Madison Avenue, the city now turning amber and violet as evening settled over Manhattan. There were no screens, no polished sales renderings, no minimalist emptiness pretending to be sophistication. Only memory, purpose, time. Ethan stepped inside slowly, as if entering a chapel built for people who believed in work instead of worship. "What is this?" he asked, though the answer was already forming somewhere in him. Clara moved to one of the shelves and ran her fingertips across the spines as if greeting old friends. "This is where the building keeps its reasons." She pulled out a thick leather album and placed it on the table in front of him. Ethan opened it. Photographs. Hundreds of them. Tenants at ribbon cuttings. Holiday breakfasts in the cafe. A young Mrs. Romano holding up the first wedding gown she had altered in Suite 714. The two brothers from the music licensing office grinning beside a folding desk and a cheap secondhand printer. A legal clinic on the 7th floor offering free help to immigrant families on Saturdays. Children drawing at the cafe tables while parents finished work upstairs. A handwritten note tucked between pages. "Thank you for giving us one more year when no one else would." Ethan turned another page, then another. Each image was a quiet indictment of the man he had been. Not cruel, just undeniable. "My father documented every lease that mattered," Clara said softly. "Not by price, by impact." Ethan looked up. The fading light from the windows had caught the edge of her hair, turning it almost gold. "He kept all of this here?" Clara nodded. He called it the ledger behind the ledger. She walked to a small cabinet near the window and opened the top drawer. Inside were dozens of paper sleeves from coffee cups, each flattened carefully and stacked with ribbon around them in dated bundles. Ethan frowned, confused for half a second, then felt his chest tighten as recognition hit. Clara lifted one bundle and set it beside the album. "You were not the only person I watched," she said. "But you were the one who changed the least for the longest time." Ethan stared at the sleeves. Some were blank. Some had short notes in neat blue ink. "Slept 2 hours. Be gentle. Closed the deal. Forgot to eat. Angry before 8. Needs water." One line made his throat go dry. Today he smiled at the janitor. Clara's voice remained calm, but something more vulnerable moved beneath it now. "My father taught me that the first 5 minutes of a person's day tell you whether they are becoming who they think they are. So I wrote things down. Not to judge, to remember." Ethan reached toward the top sleeve, but stopped before touching it. "You kept all of them." It was barely a whisper. "Not all," Clara said. "Only the ones that meant something." He looked at her then, really looked, with no marble lobby between them and no paper cup to hide behind. "And what do these say now?" he asked. The city lights flickered on below them, one by one, as if Manhattan itself were leaning closer to hear her answer. Clara held his gaze for a long, quiet moment. "That for the first time," she said softly, "you may finally be ready to understand why I never wanted to sell this building at all." The city was almost fully dark by the time Ethan Caldwell closed the leather album and looked up from the table in the hidden library. Below them, Madison Avenue shimmered in ribbons of headlights and reflections, the wet pavement catching every passing taxi like scattered gold. Inside that quiet room above the building he had once treated like an asset class, the silence felt different now. Not empty, earned. Clara Whitmore stood by the window, one hand resting lightly on the old oak frame, her reflection layered against the skyline like she belonged to both the city and something deeper than it. Ethan had spent his adult life mastering numbers, leverage, timing, negotiation. He knew how to spot weakness in a term sheet from across the room. He knew how to turn underused square footage into profit before most people finished their coffee. But in that moment, staring at the paper sleeve she had kept for years, he understood something so simple it made his chest tighten. He had mistaken attention for ownership. He had thought because he moved through a place every day, because people made space when he walked in, because doors opened and elevators waited and coffee appeared in his hand exactly when he wanted it, that he understood the world around him. He had not. He had simply been carried by it. I was going to gut the lobby, he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. Replace the cafe. Raise rents. Push out half the tenants by the second renewal. He did not say it defensively. He said it like confession. Clara did not turn right away. I know, she said softly. That should have embarrassed him more than it did. Somehow, it only made the truth easier to bear. Ethan let out a breath that felt like he had been holding it for years. And the worst part is I thought that made me smart. Now she looked at him. Not with pity. Never pity. Just that same clear gaze that had unnerved him over 1,000 mornings. It made you efficient, she said. Those are not the same thing. A small, humorless smile touched his mouth. No, they are not. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the lobby far below. Through the glass, he could just make out the warm pool of light where the cafe sat at the corner of the marble floor. Even from up here, it looked less like a business than a heartbeat. He imagined the morning rush he had finally seen from the other side. Mrs. Romano and her hot water. Ben at security. The anxious tenant who needed 3 quiet minutes before court. The janitor who deserved to be looked in the eye. The therapist's clients who needed soft lighting in the hallway. All the people who had shaped the building without ever appearing in a prospectus. So what happens now, he asked. Clara crossed the room, opened the leather folder she had carried all day, and placed a new set of documents on the table between them. No red lines. No marked up transfer clauses. Just a clean proposal. Now, she said, I offer you the deal I should have offered in the first place. Ethan looked down. Not acquisition. Not controlling stake. Not purchase and redevelopment. A long-term partnership agreement. Shared stewardship. Capital. Improvements tied to tenant protection. Preservation of the cafe. A fund for legacy businesses. Renovations approved only if they increased function without erasing character. Quarterly review with final veto rights held equally by both parties. He stared at the page, then at her. You are not selling me the building. Clara's expression softened, just slightly. No, she said. I am seeing whether you are ready to help me protect it. The words landed so quietly they nearly undid him. Not because she was trusting him. Because she did not have to. She had all the power. The building. The board. The history, the truth, and still, after everything he had failed to see, she was not asking him to kneel. She was asking him to rise. Ethan picked up the pen beside the contract, then paused. Before I sign anything, he said, and for the first time in 4 years, he asked the question that should have come long before spreadsheets and floor plans and projected returns. Why did you keep serving me coffee? Clara looked at him for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was so quiet it felt like part of the room itself. Because every morning, I hoped the man who walked in would eventually become the one who deserved to stay. Ethan signed. Not because the terms were brilliant, though they were. Not because the building was valuable, though it was. He signed because for the first time in a very long time, he wanted to build something that would still matter when the money stopped talking. The next morning, the city woke under a clear spring sky. Sunlight poured through the lobby windows in long pale bars across the marble. The cafe doors opened at 6:30 sharp. Tenants began to arrive in coats and sneakers and polished shoes, carrying briefcases, garment bags, gym duffels, and the invisible weight of ordinary lives. Ethan came through the front entrance, not the private elevator. No assistant. No phone at his ear. Just a navy coat over an open collar and a face that looked somehow less armored than it had the week before. Clara stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled, white tulips fresh in their vase, the espresso machine hissing softly as morning began again. She set a paper cup on the counter. 2 shots. No sugar. Lid pressed down tight. But this time, Ethan did not reach for it immediately. He stepped closer. He looked at her the way a person looks at a doorway after finally understanding where it leads. Then, with the entire warm rhythm of the building moving quietly around them, he wrapped both hands around the cup and said the words that mattered more than any contract he had ever signed. Good morning, Clara. A small smile touched her face, gentle and real. "Good morning, Ethan." And for the first time since he had entered that building years ago, he did not walk away while speaking into a phone. He stood there for one extra second, long enough to notice the sunlight, long enough to hear Mrs. Romano laughing at table 6, long enough to thank Ben at security, long enough to understand that some people do not reveal their worth by asking to be seen. They reveal it by making a place so human that one day, even a man like Ethan Caldwell is forced to finally open his eyes.